So I want to say that to me, one of the greatest blessings of a deeply embodied awakening is that the non-separateness of awakened being makes the whole world feel close and dear and intimate and kindred and deeply moving. And there's a newness and a tenderness to all your perceptions that make your very ordinary life appear mysteriously deeper and pregnant with meaning. And this is because you're not fundamentally separate from anything. And that includes both the glory and the horror. It's like you're living inside of Martin Buber's I-thou relationship to the world. He says an I-thou relationship is characterized by intensity, clarity, and yet ineffability, where everything feels animate and alive and precious, as if all objects of perception are also in some inexplicable way subjects as well. And for many people, this subject quality in things we would normally think of as objects is limited to objects in the natural world. But I find even human-created objects can have this animate inner aliveness. As an example, when I sit at the breakfast table holding my cereal bowl, I'm quite taken by the beauty of the glossy cobalt blue color of the bowl and the subtle pattern that's embossed into its surface that my eyes miss but my fingers discover as its welcoming warmth spreads into my hands, and I whisper, I love you. The whole universe is alive, and you see heart and soul everywhere. And this communion can, at times, become quite fervent and, well, honestly, ecstatic even. But not ecstatic in an otherworldly way, but still very much of this world, but seeing and hearing and tasting, smelling and touching from a much deeper level of intimacy. And unfortunately, along with the hypermasculinity that's just present throughout the world, we also tend to have a cultural bias against ecstasy, believe it or not. It makes it seem weird or abnormal in some way. So it's perfectly acceptable, as you might think, to be, or even praiseworthy, to be stressed, worried, exhausted. That's normal. But to be ecstatic, with gratitude exploding in all directions, is generally seen to be odd. And no doubt it's because it's subversive to many of these presumptions of that world, that go get 'em, work harder, do more, get more culture. It's very much not about communion, but more about separateness. It's even built into the language we use to describe achievement in that aggressive world. Words like exceptional, distinguished, outstanding, which are used as praise, but they're also all about elevating separateness. Yeah. So there can be an ecstatic communion. And speaking of ecstasy, in a tantric process like Trillium, our metaphysics views matter in general, and the body in particular, as every bit as real as spirit. Spirit and matter are co-equal partners in the arising of this whole manifest realm. And if Shiva is consciousness and if Shakti is phenomena, it's not an accident that traditionally they are depicted together, locked in yab-yum, ecstatic sexual union. And as you know, the symbol of Shiva, the linga, the sort of long oblong stone, is always balanced vertically on the symbol of Shakti. Yoni stone, which is smooth and flat and has a cup in it. In point of fact, the linga stone cannot be balanced vertically without the yoni stone holding it. So there's a deeper truth here, that the tall, proud erection of the masculine linga is entirely dependent on the support of the feminine yoni for it to be vertical. It can't do it on its own. So they are co-equal partners in their dance, in their lovemaking, which we call this phenomenal world, this existence, consciousness and phenomena. And, well, as long as we're speaking of lingas and yonis, we should say, even though we don't talk about this a lot, but it is true that in this work we have a positive view of sexuality, just as we do of all things physical. This is an embodied awakening, and savoring, relishing, appreciating all of your physical, bodily, sensual life is really central to this process. So I hope you all know your body is utterly sacred, and every bodily experience is potentially a portal to grace. And that's why being in this material world, in this body, has immense evolutionary potential. Now, there are more what we traditionally call Advaitic cultures. Advaita means undivided. Means not, and Dvaita is divided. Undivided, non-dual. More Advaitic traditions of awakening hold that only immutable consciousness is ultimately real, the Shiva part. And all the changing impermanent fluctuations are unreal, the Shakti part. And they also feel that many of the manifestations of the fluctuations are to be avoided by spiritual practitioners. There's usually long lists of do's and don'ts. And this is where Tantric and Advaitic traditions part company. This very idea that consciousness and phenomena are at odds with each other. They're not. Tantra asks the revolutionary question, what if there's nothing to renounce? What if consciousness and phenomena, spirit and matter, are inseparable partners in a dance that's just continually going on? Yeah, and what ultimately happens in this embodied awakening life is a greater and greater appreciation of the fusion of those forces, those energies. Awakened life becomes more about the quiet exaltation of living the unity within the diversity. And this is not just the whole along with the partial, which would be wondrous enough by itself, but there's much more to be discovered. Over time, what happens is this starts to feel like living the whole, not along with, but rather as the partial. The eternal is lived as the temporal, the limitless as the limited, and the ineffable as the expressed. This is why I mentioned earlier, there's a kind of burning quality to this raw experience. The love at this depth of realization and embodiment has a kind of heartbreaking quality that is somehow innate. And as we go deeper, we find ourselves flummoxed and gobsmacked to discover that the growing intensity of the goddess's embrace seems to be bottomless. And that's why those who experience this level authentically are continually and sometimes tearfully bowing down in humble adoration. They are living from that tender soul nature that sees and feels the world from a place of wholeness. It's like Teilhard de Chardin said, "Nothing here below is profane for those who know how to see."
Mm.
Yeah. So that's what we're talking about here.